Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. This is part 4 of VLAD the Impaler from Extra History. I hope you guys have been enjoying this series. Thank you to everybody, and we had a bunch of people who responded to my question in episode 3 about the pronunciation of what they call on here Wallachia. And two things I learned that I did not know, so thank you guys for that. Number one, that it's probably best pronounced as Wallachia. So Wallachia is how I'll probably try to remember it from now on. But secondly, that it's really an exonym. In other words, it's not a name that is used in Romania. They don't call it that there. They have another name for it. It's really something that's only called by outside people who don't live in Romania. So very cool. And that's what I love about this channel. What I love about this community is how much I learn from you guys. And that's why I throw those questions out there. So please keep that coming. Use the comment section below anytime you have something to add to the conversation. But it's time now to dive into part 4 of VLAD the Impaler. So talking about this idea of exonyms, the idea that a place name is different inside of a country than it is outside. There's some examples of that I can think of right off the top of my head. So, you know, there's a city in Germany that we in English call Munich, but in German it's München. So it's not the same word, it's spelled differently. You know, some of them are very similar, like Warsaw, Poland, Warszawa in Polish, things like that. But some of them are very different too. You know, Japan, we call it in English. I think in Japanese it's Nippon. So things like that. You know, there's a lot of those where sometimes the word is completely different outside the country than it is within, and not just a different translation of that. So if you want to read more about that, on Wikipedia, they actually have a whole article called English Exonyms, where the place name for an English language is completely different than it is in another language, and sometimes very much different. So just kind of a cool aside as we dive into this idea of exonyms.
(1461). The Danube. Vlad Dracula puts pen to paper to tell his ally Matthias Corvinus, the king of Hungary, about how many he has killed attacking Ottoman territory. 23,884 Turks and Bulgarians in all, not including those who were burned in their houses and whose heads were not presented to our officials. But he also writes, this will lead to an all-out war with Mehmed. When the weather permits, that is to say in the spring, they will come with evil intentions, and
that's his brother right there, Radu the Handsome, so
all of their power. And when they did, Vlad would find himself fighting alone. Thanks so much to Raycon for helping keep history alive. Vlad's attack on Ottoman territory across the Danube River didn't just come out of nowhere. He knew that his brother Radu was still on the Ottoman court, just in case Vlad needed to be replaced, and he was aware of Mehmed's expansionist designs.
So just a random observation here that I really appreciate about Extra History, and a lot of channels are good at things like this. But one of the things I love is that in their animations, just having that simple name tag with a letter on it is enough to kind of help you keep these characters straight in your mind. Little details like that really make a big difference.
Indeed, it was obvious to everyone an attack was coming, because a few years earlier, Pope Pius II and the Venetians had raised money in order to fund a crusade that would prevent further Ottoman expansion. But while Matthias Corvinus, Frederick III, and other rulers had taken the Pope's money, because, you know, free money, they were slow to actually do anything productive with it. Because while most European monarchs talked a big game about defending against the Muslim Turks, the reality was that for most kingdoms, their Christian neighbor states were a much more credible threat. In fact, in desperation, Pope Pius reached out to other Muslim states in hopes of convincing them to attack the Ottomans to keep Mehmed tied down. Plus, Vlad had his own border troubles, namely his cousin Stephen, who he'd helped put on the throne of Moldavia. But now Stephen had switched sides and became an Ottoman vassal, massing his troops on Vlad's borders so that if the Ottomans came, Vlad would have to fend off armies from 2 directions.
You know, it's a constant game. Everybody's always looking for the edge. And if it means allying with somebody who's previously my enemy, that's what I'll do. And that's not just in this part of the world. That's everywhere that it was done that way. And it's still done that way sometimes today.
That came to pass in 1462, when one night, Mehmed and Vlad's brother Radu led Ottoman forces across the Danube and into Wallachia. Vlad opposed him with a battery of cannons, but when the Ottomans raised their own artillery positions and began firing back, he withdrew. Vlad was simply outnumbered and outgunned. Mehmed had between 60 and 70,000 troops and 120 cannons, whereas Vlad could only muster 10,000 soldiers in his main force, most of which peasants, rather than professionals. Now, a word of caution here. While we do know what happened in this war, there's still a debate about the location, order of events, and even what Vlad and Mehmed's strategic objectives were. Mehmed, for his part, probably didn't want to outright conquer Wallachia.
So, it's fascinating, even from the 15th century, how little we know sometimes about what really happened. This goes back to what I talked about last episode about how, the history's only as good as the sources. And the closer to the real events the sources are, the better. But also, who's writing these accounts? And how much can we really trust? And how and why are they going to bias themselves? Because, even talking about things like Julius Caesar, he wrote everything down, but it was all biased in his favor, so how much of it was really true? And that's true here too. But, it's amazing, just, 500 years ago, a lot of events we have so well documented from so many sources, but these events are largely shrouded in mystery still because there aren't the multiple sources so that we can put everything together and kind of figure out, okay, what do they all agree on and what truth can we glean from all of these sources? We don't have that option here.
Bring it into the empire. It was more valuable, after all, as a buffer zone against Hungary, but of course with the more dependable Radu in charge rather than Vlad. Also, he was interested in Stephen helping him take back a Black Sea fortress. Whereas Vlad, of course, wanted to stay on the throne and expel Mehmed from his lands. But he did know he couldn't beat Mehmed in the field, so instead, he used guerrilla tactics. He sent word for Wallachian civilians to flee to the Carpathian Mountains, then retreated, burning the land behind him and poisoning water sources to deny the Ottoman army food. Then, his horsemen harried Mehmed's column, striking and disappearing, occasionally taking captives, waiting for a moment to land a hard blow. Which came when the Ottoman army camped outside of the capital of Târgoviște, not noticing that spies passed in their midst. According to folklore, one of those spies was in fact Vlad himself, using his command of Turkish to pass himself off as a soldier.
That's pretty
and
epic.
Whether true or not, the scouts learned what they needed to know: the location of Mehmed's tent. Wallachian cavalry screamed into the unaware Ottoman force, slashing down with swords and burning canvas tents.
Seems like it's probably a suicide mission. I don't know what happened, so I'm curious to see. But I'm guessing they had to have known we're riding into the camp. We're going to try to get a quick strike on the Sultan, but we're probably not getting out of here alive.
Killing hundreds in the shock assault before many in the Ottoman camp could even pick up weapons. And Vlad stormed through the melee, slicing his way into Mehmed's personal tent to find it empty. Mehmed happened to be somewhere else. Vlad called a retreat. His planned decapitation strike had failed.
Pretty epic, though.
The next day, the armies finally met in earnest, where Vlad lost 2,000 soldiers and abandoned the capital to Mehmed, running with his shattered army for the safety of the mountains. But he left something behind. As Mehmed and Radu approached Târgoviște, their troops saw what from a distance looked like a stand of trees. That is, until they got closer. They were bodies. Ottoman captives from Vlad's depredations along the Danube, and the soldiers he'd snatched during the guerrilla campaign. Men, women, children, all impaled in a macabre display, with birds nesting in their corpses. One account puts the number at 20,000,
Wow.
roughly the amount Vlad himself had claimed to kill in his letter to Matthias Corvinus. But while this terror tactic did shake the approaching Ottoman troops, it actually opened another avenue for Mehmed. He had, after all, brought his favorite Radu the Handsome to replace Vlad, and Vlad's long-standing campaigns of public cruelty and his war on the boyars had not exactly endeared him to what was left of Wallachian nobility.
Remember, we talked about this, and we always talk about this, Eventually you go too far. When you go extreme like this, when you use fear as a weapon, you almost always go too far. It's impossible to see it at the time that that's what you've done, but in hindsight, many centuries later, we can easily see when they've gone too far. And eventually, rather than scaring people into following you, what you do is you scare them into following someone else.
So with Vlad on the run, clearly defeated, boyars increasingly defected to Radu. The new prince, now enthroned at Targovishta, quickly reached out to elements Vlad had clashed with, like the Transylvanian Saxons. A great warrior he was perhaps not, but he was a cunning enough diplomat to offer himself as a more reasonable alternative to his vicious brother, even if he was an Ottoman puppet. Vlad was defeated, out of power, his troops likely deserting in increasing numbers. The only upside was that his fortress on the Black Sea had withstood a siege by both Stephen and Mehmed, but that was cold comfort. And within weeks, Vlad's support had melted to the point that Mehmed went home, leaving Radu to run things, secure on his new throne. Now hiding in the Carpathian Mountains, Vlad had but one hope. See, there was rumors that his old ally, Matthias Corvinus, was marching toward Wallachia with a Hungarian army. So Vlad dispatched messages begging for regaining his throne. And Corvinus came with a pair of shackles. See, Corvinus didn't necessarily want to battle Mehmed at that moment. But the Pope and Venetians had, after all, given him all that nice money to fight the Ottomans with, and it just seemed like such a waste to use it fighting the Ottomans, you know? But he did have to show he'd done something. So he arrested Vlad, producing several forged letters to prove that Vlad had been collaborating with Mehmed, offering to make war on Hungary in exchange for regaining his throne. And no, it doesn't make a lot of sense. In fact, even Corvinus's court historian seems to think it was a little thin. But Corvinus needed to show the Pope a victory, and uncovering Vlad's treachery was a way to do that without expending his military. So Vlad was a prisoner once again, and would remain one for 14 years.
Yep.
We have little documentation on Vlad during this period, apart from the fact that he was held for a few years, and then allowed to settle in a house in Pest.
A lot of the times when you read about members of the nobility in captivity, it's not like they're in a dungeon somewhere. Sometimes it happens that way, but more often than not, nobles holding other nobles hostage tended to keep them in relative comfort. Because, hey, someday it could be me that's being held captive by someone else, and I want the same consideration. They kind of had that treatment. Even the way they executed fellow nobles. You know, you look at England, for example, if you were a member of nobility, you got beheaded. You didn't get hanged, drawn, and quartered. That was something that was done to lower class people. So there was that standard that was held by fellow nobles.
Transitioning from being strictly a prisoner to more of an exiled noble, forbidden from leaving the country. Though among the few stories we have about him during this time is one violent incident involving Hungarian troops. Apparently, a thief had run and hid in Vlad's home, and then when a squad of troops burst in to pursue him, Vlad had their leader executed on the spot. He'd argued, successfully, that he was within his rights because the troops had not asked for an invitation. Meanwhile, as Vlad stewed, causing a few diplomatic incidents in Pest, Radu lost the throne to another rival, and when the news hit a clearly restless Vlad, he pushed Corvinus to give him an army to recover Wallachia. Because remember, according to Corvinus, Vlad was still the legitimate prince, and Vlad argued he could be useful. But while Corvinus still refused for years to support Vlad, he did increasingly give his pet Wallachian prince a longer and longer leash, letting him move around within Hungary and settle in Transylvania, giving him clearance to gather followers around him. Staging Vlad across the border, exactly like all those pretenders had done during Vlad's rule, Corvinus was testing Dracula, seeing if he could trust him. And in 1476, the biggest test came, when he sent Vlad along on military expeditions against the Ottomans in Bosnia, and to bail Vlad's cousin Stephen out when his relationship with Mehmed soured and the Sultan invaded Moldavia, though it was only a prelude. Within months, a Hungarian army was marching on Targovishta, and Vlad and Stephen, armies now united, barely missed capturing the deposed prince as he fled to Mehmed. So in November 1476, Vlad once again became the Prince of Wallachia.
Briefly.
In his life, he'd been a hostage.
We talked about this before. He spent more time as a hostage, much more time as a hostage, more time in jail than he ever spent on the throne. He spent very little time comparatively on the throne for somebody who's had such an impact on history.
A fugitive exile, a prince, a captive, a general, and both a rebel and an oppressor. He'd carried his sword for the Ottomans, Hungarians, Moldavians, a pope, and a sultan. Now in his mid-40s, it would be his third reign as prince. And though it would only last 2 months, Vlad would live forever. Whew.
So I guess the next episode we're going to talk a little bit about how Bram Stoker turned him into the Dracula that we all know today. And actually there's a really fascinating story concerning what happened to Vlad's body. A couple of different theories on what happened to him after he was, the best historical accounts we have is that he was killed in battle in 1377 or in 1477. But as recently as a couple of years ago, there's been a theory proposed about where his body is, and they're trying to get permission to open up the grave. I think it's in Naples, where they think he might be buried now. So we'll explore some of that in the next episode, and I'll show you some of those things. But this is one we might actually take a look at the lies episode. A lot of you have suggested that because they address some of the things I've been talking about in these videos. But let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below, and we will be back tomorrow with episode 5. Thanks for watching.